A broke mechanic paid $120 for a rusted shell at a farm auction. Nobody looked twice. To everyone there, it was scrap metal on 4 flat tires. Junk, nothing more. But at a packed automotive showcase, cameras rolling the CEO of one of America's most powerful car companies walked up to that car, looked the man dead in the eye, and ordered it destroyed. She called it garbage. She called him a joke. What she didn't know was that beneath 30 years of rust sat a machine worth more than $3 million. Liam Harper didn't talk much about the things he noticed. That was the habit of a man who spent most of his working life underneath other people's cars, hands in the greasier, pressed to metal, reading what a machine was trying to say. He ran a small repair shop on the edge of town, the kind of place without a sign out front, just a rusted mailbox and a reputation that spread by word of mouth. His customers came because he fixed things right the first time and didn't charge them for work they didn't need. He wasn't the kind of man people looked at twice. Medium height, broad through the shoulders, with oil permanently worked into the lines of his knuckles, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He wore the same kind of clothes every day, dark jeans, a worn flannel boots that had seen better years. His daughter Aria, 16, and sharp-eyed, in a way that sometimes embarrassed him, once told him he dressed like a man who had decided the world could take it or leave it. He hadn't disagreed. His wife Claire had been gone for 4 years. She'd died quickly, and without warning the way some people do, and Liam had spent the first year after trying to understand how something that large could happen so quietly. He never fully did. What he had, instead, was the shop, the routine in Aria, who had grown steadily taller and steadily more like her mother in ways that occasionally stopped him mid-sentence. He didn't talk about that either. The farm auction on the first Saturday of October wasn't the kind of event that attracted serious collectors. It was a family estate sale out past the county line, folding tables of kitchen equipment, rusted hand tools, 3 tractors that had seen their best decade sometime in the 1980s. Liam had driven out only because a neighbor had mentioned there might be an old differential housing worth salvaging. There wasn't, but there was. At the far end of a gravel lot behind a collapsed hay shelter, a car. Calling it a car was generous. It sat on 4 flat tires, the body panels eaten through with rust. Along every seam the windshield cracked, in a long diagonal line from corner to corner. The hood was slightly warped, the interior gutted down to bare metal. Whoever had last driven it had done so a long time ago, and whoever had stored it since had made no effort to protect it from time. It looked like something you'd pass without slowing down. Liam slowed down. He walked around it once without touching anything. The shape was wrong for a barn find of no consequence, the proportions too specific, the wheelbase too short, the body line too deliberate. This wasn't an accident of design. He crouched near the rear and ran his thumb along the frame rail, feeling the dimensions under the rust. Then he found the VIN plate still riveted near the firewall, and he read the number 3 times before he stood up. He bought the car for $120. The auctioneer looked faintly confused. The 6 other people present didn't look up from their phones. That evening in his shop, with the door closed and a work light angled at the firewall, Liam ran the VIN against every database he had access to. Then he drove to the library and ran it again. The result was the same each time. What was sitting on a flatbed trailer in his yard, disguised beneath 30 years of accumulated rust and neglect, was a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427, one of the original production cars, unmodified, with a matching numbers engine that, according to the last recorded title, Transfer had simply disappeared from the market in the early 1980s and not resurfaced since. He sat with that knowledge for a while. Cars like this didn't show up at farm auctions. They showed up at Sotheby's or at Barrett-Jackson, under lights surrounded by men in sport coats who had been waiting years for exactly this moment. In the condition it was in before restoration, It was worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1.5 million. Fully restored, correctly documented with provenance, verified it could clear $3 million without difficulty. He had paid $120 for it. He told no one. He covered it with 2 heavy tarps, locked the shop, and went inside to make dinner. There was no reason to tell anyone yet. The car needed documentation, work, needed inspection, needed time. And Liam had learned without anyone teaching him that announcing what you had was how you lost it. The Holt Motors Classic Showcase was held each year in mid-October at the Brennan Event Center, a convention facility on the north side of the city, with a glass atrium and a parking structure that could hold 1,200 cars. It was by automotive world standards, a significant event curated, ticketed, attended by collectors and press and the particular subspecies of enthusiast who tracked these things obsessively and photographed everything. Holt Motors sponsored it entirely, and their name was on every banner, every placard, every printed program. Liam hadn't planned to bring the Cobra. He had been hired 3 weeks earlier to deliver a restored 1955 Bel Air to its owner, a retired contractor named Gerald, who was exhibiting the car at the showcase. The job was straightforward transport and light detailing before handoff. Liam had arranged a proper enclosed trailer for the Bel Air. The problem arose the morning of the event when he discovered his shop's security system had been glitching intermittently for 2 days, and the secondary lock on the rear door had stopped engaging properly. Leaving the Cobra unattended in a building with a compromised lock, even for 1 day, wasn't something he was willing to do, so he loaded it. He put the Bel Air in the enclosed trailer, hitched the Cobra in its own open trailer behind his truck, covered it with its tarps, and drove to the Brennan Event Center. His plan was to park the trailer in the overflow lot, deliver the Bel Air, and stay close enough to the vehicle to keep an eye on it while he completed the handoff. Arya rode with him, her feet on the dashboard, the way she always did when she thought he wasn't going to say anything about it. He didn't. The event was already moving when they arrived. Registration tables set up in the main atrium vehicles, positioned on the polished floor, under track lighting television cameras from 2 local stations. Gerald was waiting near the south entrance, and the Bel Air handoff was smooth and quick. Liam accepted a handshake and a check, and that should have been the end of his involvement. He had just walked back toward the overflow lot when the situation changed. Evelyn Holt had a way of moving through a room that people noticed whether they wanted to or not. She was in her mid-40s, composed with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself because it had never been questioned. She ran Holt Motors the way her father had, directly without sentiment, with a particular impatience for things that didn't meet the standard she had decided on. She dressed expensively and simply, and she didn't smile at people unless she meant it, which meant she didn't smile often. She had been doing a final walkthrough of the showcase floor when a member of her events team flagged her toward the south side entrance. One of the transport vehicles, he said, had left a secondary trailer in a position that was visible from the main atrium windows. The trailer was uncovered on one side. The wind had caught one of the tarps, and the car on it was not by any reasonable assessment suited to be adjacent to a curated automotive showcase. Evelyn walked to the window first, then she walked outside. What she saw was a rusted, partially exposed hulk on an open trailer parked 40 feet from a glass wall through which journalists and collectors were currently visible with cameras. The car had no paint to speak of. The body panels were corroded along every edge. One of the tires had partially deflated during transport, and the whole thing listed slightly to one side. It looked, from where she stood, like something that should have been junked a decade ago. She found Liam beside the trailer, resecuring the tarp that had come loose. "Is this yours?" she said. Liam looked up. He placed her immediately, not from any personal interaction, but from the event lanyards, and the way the events coordinator who had followed her outside was standing slightly behind her left shoulder. He nodded. Evelyn looked at the car, then back at him. "This vehicle is not registered as part of the showcase. It shouldn't be in this lot." and it certainly shouldn't be visible from inside the atrium. Her voice was measured, but contained no room for negotiation. "I need you to move it." "I'm parked in the overflow lot," Liam said. "That was the arrangement I made with the transport coordinator when I arrived." "The arrangement you made doesn't account for the fact that this thing is in view of every camera inside that building." She gestured toward the glass. "This is a curated event. We have standards for what appears in our space, and whatever this is doesn't meet them." There were people beginning to drift toward the south entrance, now a handful of showcase attendees who had noticed the conversation through the glass and come out the way people do when something seems like it might become interesting. One of the local news cameras had repositioned. Evelyn didn't lower her voice. She didn't appear to consider it necessary. "This is an embarrassment," she said, with the clarity of someone used to having that kind of statement go unchallenged. "I don't know what you thought you were doing bringing a piece of scrap metal to a professional automotive showcase, but I want it gone. I want a tow truck here in 10 minutes. The word she used, scrap, landed in the air and stayed there. Several people had their phones out now. The news camera was definitely recording. Liam stood with the tarp in his hands and said nothing for a moment. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was calculating. The car was on an open trailer. A tow truck meant hitching the trailer and moving it, but if the operator wasn't careful, if they rushed it, if the load shifted on a compromised tire, there was real potential for damage. Not superficial damage. Structural damage to a vehicle that had survived intact for nearly 60 years, precisely because no one had mishandled it. He set the tarp down. "You don't want to do this," he said. Evelyn's expression didn't shift. "I'm not asking your opinion. I'm telling you it needs to be removed. If you won't move it yourself, I'll have it moved." She turned to the events coordinator and said quietly, but within earshot of the people who had gathered to call the tow service they used for overflow parking violations. Aria had come around from the other side of the truck when the crowd started forming. She was tall like her father, with her mother's dark eyes, and she read situations the way he did quickly, without showing much on her face. But she had been standing close enough to hear all of it, and when Evelyn gave the order for the tow truck, something shifted in Aria's expression that Liam caught because he was always watching for it. She didn't say anything, but her jaw tightened, and her eyes went to the trailer, then back to her father, with the particular fear of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and had no power to do anything about it. That expression, that specific controlled fear on his daughter's face, was the thing that settled everything for Liam. He stepped in front of the trailer hitch, not dramatically. He didn't raise his hands or say anything. He simply moved to the position that made it physically impossible to hook a tow vehicle to the trailer without going through him first, and he stood there with his arms at his sides and his weight square. The crowd had grown. The news camera was close now, close enough that he could hear the faint mechanical sound of the lens adjusting. Evelyn turned back and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who could not locate any precedent in their experience for what they were seeing. "You're obstructing." "I'm standing in a parking lot," Liam said. His voice was the same as it always was, flat, unrushed. "On my own property, next to my vehicle. This vehicle is being removed," she said. "You're making a scene." "You're the one who called a tow truck in front of a news camera," he said. "I'm just standing here." The events coordinator had his phone to his ear. Someone in the crowd said something that made 2 or 3 other people laugh. Liam couldn't tell if it was at him or at Evelyn, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that the tow truck hadn't arrived yet, and every second it didn't arrive was a second. The situation continued to shift. He looked directly at Evelyn Holt and said with the same level voice he used when he was telling someone their transmission was shot, and it was going to cost them, "You're making the most expensive mistake of your life." She stared at him. The crowd stared at him. The camera was still rolling. "I'm giving you the chance to stop it right now," he said, "before the truck gets here, before this goes further than you want it to." Evelyn's expression moved through something surprise, or the memory of surprise, and then settled back into composure. She did not stop the tow truck call. She did not walk back inside. She held his gaze the way people do when they have decided to win something, and she waited. So did Liam. He stood in front of the trailer hitch with the October air moving across the parking lot and the camera still running, and Arya standing 6 feet to his left, and he did not move an inch. Whatever happened next was going to happen to a man who had already made his decision. The car behind him was worth more money than most people in that parking lot would see in a decade. But that wasn't why he wasn't moving. He wasn't moving because his daughter had looked at that trailer with fear in her eyes, and he had decided, without needing to think about it, that no one was going to take something that belonged to them. Not today. The tow truck arrived 8 minutes later. It was a heavy-duty unit, the kind used for commercial vehicles, and when it turned into the overflow lot, the driver looked at the situation with the practiced blankness of someone who had been called to enough contentious jobs to know better than to take sides before he understood what he was being paid to do. He pulled alongside the trailer, stepped out, and read the scene the same way people read rooms quickly, without committing to anything. The events coordinator moved toward him immediately, pointing at the trailer and talking fast. The driver listened. Then he looked at Liam standing at the hitch and at the crowd that had formed along the entrance walk, and at the news camera that was no longer making any effort to appear casual about what it was filming. Evelyn stood with her arms folded, watching. She had the composure of someone who had made a decision and had decided that changing it was no longer an option, regardless of what the decision cost. Her events coordinator had called the non-emergency police line while the tow truck was en route and a patrol car was reportedly 10 minutes out. She had resources and authority and the legal standing of a private event on a property her company was paying for, and she intended to use all three. The crowd was larger now. 40 or 50 people spilled out from the main atrium, most of them with phones raised. Some were filming the standoff. Others had already moved to posting the way people do instinctively when they sense something tipping toward a moment. 2 of the showcase's registered collectors stood near the edge of the group, speaking to each other in low voices. A man in a sport coat near the front had his arms crossed and was watching Liam the way you watch someone on a high ledge, not rooting for anything in particular, just unable to look away. The events coordinator turned to Liam and delivered the terms clearly, loudly enough for the surrounding people to hear. Vacate the position at the trailer, allow the vehicle to be towed to a public lot 2 blocks away, and no further action would be taken. If he refused, a police officer would arrive, and the removal would proceed regardless, potentially with his detention for obstruction of a private event. The coordinator said all of this in the tone of someone reading from a compliance policy, which was the most intimidating way it could have been said. Arya hadn't moved from the position she'd taken when the crowd started building 6 feet to Liam's left back, slightly against the truck's passenger door, watching everything without speaking. She had the kind of stillness that looked like calm, but wasn't. Liam knew the difference. He'd known it since she was small, the way she went very quiet when she was scared and didn't want anyone to see it. She wasn't looking at Evelyn or the coordinator or the camera. She was looking at the trailer, at the covered shape beneath the tarp, and her jaw was set in a way that made her look more like her mother than she probably knew. Liam did not move from the hitch. "Go ahead and call them," he said to the coordinator. "That's your right. But I'd make sure your employer understands what's on this trailer before the officer arrives, because that conversation is going to get complicated very quickly." The coordinator looked at Evelyn. Evelyn gave the faintest shake of her head, the kind that means, "Don't negotiate," and the coordinator looked back at his phone. In the crowd, a man near the front said loudly enough to Carrie that the guy was probably just being difficult for the camera. Someone else agreed. A third person took a photo of the car with the tarp half off one corner, posted it, and added a caption. The social current of the situation was moving in a clear direction, and it wasn't moving toward Liam. He was the man who had brought a rusted wreck to a professional showcase and was now refusing to leave. That was the story available to anyone watching without context, and context was the first thing that gets lost in a crowd. Liam stood with his weight settled and his hands loose at his sides. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the tow truck driver, who had not moved to connect the truck to the trailer, and who was still standing near his cab, with his arms folded in the careful posture of a man waiting for clarity before he committed to any action. That hesitation mattered. A driver who hitched without the registered owner's consent was a driver with potential liability exposure, and experienced drivers knew it. The woman who changed everything walked out of the main atrium entrance 40 seconds before the patrol car arrived. Diana Weston was in her early 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of economy of movement that comes from spending decades in environments where being mistaken is expensive. She was one of perhaps 30 people in the country who could identify a classic American performance car by frame dimensions alone, and she was the author of the 2 most cited technical references on mid-century Shelby production history. She had been inside the atrium as a registered guest judge for the concourse section of the showcase when someone had shown her a photo on their phone. She didn't run. She walked with purpose, and the crowd separated for her without being asked the way crowds do for people who carry that specific kind of weight. She went straight to the trailer, not to Evelyn, not to the coordinator, not to Liam. She went to the car. She pulled the tarp back from the front section herself, unceremoniously, and crouched near the firewall. She produced a small flashlight from her jacket pocket and directed it at the VIN plate. She was close to it for a long time, long enough that the crowd went quiet. The coordinator started to say something, and someone nearby told him to be quiet in a tone that made him stop. Diana stood up. She looked at the VIN plate one more time, then turned around and faced the crowd, and Evelyn both at the same time. "This vehicle is a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427, she said. Her voice was unhurried and carried clearly in the outdoor air. Original chassis, original drivetrain, matching numbers as far as I can confirm at a preliminary inspection. This is not a replica, and it is not a kit car." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I would strongly advise you to stand down, whatever you have in motion right now." The silence that followed had a specific texture. It was the silence of a large group of people recalibrating very quickly. Evelyn did not say anything immediately. She looked at Diana with the expression of someone who was trying to locate the error in what she had just heard, because the alternative that there was no error was a recalculation she wasn't ready to make in front of a crowd and a news camera. Diana didn't wait for a response. She turned to Liam, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "Where did you find it?" "Farm auction," he said. "First weekend of October, $120. Diana looked at the car again. "Who else knows?" "Just you and me now," Liam said. He glanced once at Aria, who had finally exhaled. "And my daughter." Diana nodded, as though this was the answer she expected from the kind of man who showed up to an automotive showcase with a $3 million car under a tarp, rather than calling a press agent. "I'm going to need to do a full inspection. Are you open to that?" "That's what I was waiting for," Liam said. The number moved through the crowd the way numbers do when they're large enough to be difficult to believe, first in whispers, then in full sentences, then in the kind of rapid back and forth that pulls out phones and prompts searches. 1.5 million before restoration, potentially north of 3 million after a correct and fully documented restoration by a recognized specialist. For a car purchased at a farm estate sale for $120, the math was absurd enough that people kept repeating it, as if saying it. More times would make it compute. The news camera had been filming the entire time. The footage it had captured Evelyn ordering the removal of the coordinator's compliance threat. Liam standing at the hitch, Diana's public identification of the vehicle, was already on one station's live feed. The showcase publicist, who had been inside the atrium managing media relations, came outside, looked at the situation, and immediately went back inside to make a phone call. Evelyn had not moved from her position, but the character of her standing there had changed. 20 minutes earlier, she had been a CEO, managing an unwanted disruption at her own event. Now she was a person who had on camera ordered the destruction of a museum-grade automobile and publicly humiliated the man who owned it. That was the story. It didn't require any additional context or editorializing. The footage said everything. The collectors who had been inside were coming out now in steady numbers. Not to look at the showcase floor anymore, to look at the Cobra. 2 men who had registered vehicles worth more than $500,000 each were standing at the trailer, asking Liam quiet, serious questions about provenance and documentation. Diana was still at the car, moving methodically, using her flashlight, occasionally saying a single word to herself in the manner of someone confirming a count. The tow truck driver had gotten back into his cab and was looking at his phone. The patrol car had arrived, and the officer had been briefed on the situation by the coordinator, and the officer was now standing near his vehicle, looking like a man who had realized he had driven into something much more complicated than a parking dispute. The showcase floor visible through the glass atrium wall was largely empty. Everyone was outside. By the time Diana had completed her preliminary inspection and was making calls to arrange a formal documentation process, Evelyn had retreated to the edge of the overflow lot, near the entrance to the parking structure. Her publicist was beside her, talking steadily into her ear. Her phone had been ringing at irregular intervals for the past 15 minutes, and she had answered 2 of the calls and declined the rest. She was watching Liam. He was standing with Diana and the 2 collectors, listening more than talking, nodding occasionally when Diana explained something technical. Arya was beside him. She hadn't gone back inside, hadn't picked up her phone, wasn't filming anything. She was just standing with her father the way she had been from the beginning, and she was watching the situation with the expression of someone who had decided very early in life that the best response to being underestimated was to be quiet about it and wait. The video was already at 400,000 views on one platform. The publicist relayed this to Evelyn in a voice that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Someone in the crowd had captured the moment of Evelyn's original order, the word scrap, the gesture toward the car, the command to call the tow service in a clean, close clip that was circulating on its own, decontextualized, with a caption that didn't need to say much. Evelyn made a decision. She handed her phone to her publicist, smoothed her jacket, and walked across the lot toward Liam. She waited until Diana and the collectors had moved slightly away, not asking them to just arriving at a moment when they had naturally stepped back to allow Diana to make a call before she spoke. Mr. Harper. Her voice was different now. Not softer exactly. More precise in the way of someone choosing each word with awareness of what the wrong word would cost. I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment if that's possible. Liam looked at her without changing his expression. You can speak here. Evelyn registered this, but didn't argue. She was a person who had spent 20 years in rooms where everything said had financial weight, and she understood when she was not the one setting the terms. I want to resolve this, she said. I acted on incomplete information, and I made an error in judgment. I'm prepared to compensate you for the disruption and any potential damage to the vehicle's value or reputation. Whatever number makes this right, I'm willing to discuss it. The word number sat in the air for a moment. Liam looked at the car. He looked at the people still gathered around it, collectors who hadn't looked at him twice when he arrived, journalists who had filmed Evelyn's dismissal of him with the detached interest of people watching something routine. He looked at Arya, who had heard everything, and was watching him with the same stillness she'd held for the last hour. Keep your number, he said. Evelyn studied him. Then what do you want? I didn't come here wanting anything, Liam said. I came here to do a job and drive home. You're the one who made this into something. I understand that, and I'm telling you, I'm willing to make it right. Liam looked at her steadily. The thing that bothered me the most today wasn't anything you said to me. It was watching my daughter stand there and think someone was going to take something that belonged to us, and not being able to do a single thing about it, except wait. He said it without any particular heat, just as a fact. You can't compensate for that. It's not a transaction. Evelyn had nothing to say to that. Not because she didn't have words she had in her professional life very rarely been short of words, but because the words available to her were all built for a different kind of conversation than the one she was in. She was equipped for negotiations, for damage control, for the particular language of accountability that cost money and solved problems. She did not have language for a man who was telling her that the thing she had done wrong had no price. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Arya, who looked back at her with the patient and unimpressed expression of a young woman who had been watching adults make avoidable mistakes her entire life. The Holt Motors Classic Showcase was still running behind the glass wall. The show floor had its cars and its lights and its carefully printed placards. But the event that mattered was happening outside in a parking lot next to a rusted machine on a flatbed trailer, and everyone who had come to see something real had already moved to where the real thing was. That was the situation Evelyn Holt was standing in the middle of, and she had put herself there with one word and one phone call. And there was no number large enough to move her back to the position she had occupied before she said it. The publicist had stopped talking into Evelyn's ear. The patrol officer had gotten back into his car. The collectors and journalists were still gathered around the trailer, but the energy had changed from the compressed tension of a standoff into something slower and more permanent, the kind of atmosphere that settles after a thing has already been decided, and everyone present is simply taking the time to understand what happened. Evelyn had not walked away after Liam's refusal. She stood where she was, and Liam let her stand there, and neither of them said anything for a stretch of time that felt longer than it was. What she was doing, though she may not have named it that way, was thinking. Not in the professional sense, not calculating next steps or managing exposure. She was doing the slower, more uncomfortable kind of thinking that happens when the framework you've used to understand a situation turns out to be the wrong one entirely, and you have to stand in the gap between what you thought was true and what actually is. She had looked at a car and seen embarrassment. She had looked at a man and seen someone who didn't belong. Both assessments had been wrong in the most public and documented way possible, and the footage existed, and the number was still climbing, and her publicist had confirmed that 3 automotive media outlets had already picked up the story. All of that was real, and all of it required her professional attention. But it was not the thing that was keeping her in the parking lot. The thing keeping her in the parking lot was Arya. Arya was helping Diana re-secure the tarp over the front section of the Cobra. She was careful with it, tucking the edge under the trailer rail the same way Liam did, making sure the corner stayed down against the wind. It was a small, practiced motion, the kind that comes from having done something many times. She had clearly been around this car enough to know how it needed to be handled, and she handled it without being asked, and without any performance of diligence. She just did it, the way her father did things because it needed doing, and she was the one there. Evelyn watched this for a moment. Then she walked over. She didn't approach Liam. She approached Arya directly, which was its own kind of decision, the kind that bypassed the available deflection of addressing the adult in the situation and went instead to the person she had actually wronged. Arya looked up when she heard footsteps and registered Evelyn's presence with the measured, unreadable expression she had maintained for most of the afternoon. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn said. She said it without preamble, without framing, without any of the qualifying language that corporate apologies are built from. It was a stripped sentence, and the stripping was intentional. "What I did today, the way I spoke about your father's car, the way I handled this in front of you, that was wrong. And I want to say that directly to you, not through a statement or a spokesperson." Arya held the edge of the tarp. She looked at Evelyn with the patience of someone who had decided to let the other person finish before forming an opinion. Evelyn continued. I made a judgment based on what I could see without asking what I might be missing. I've been doing this for a long time, and I should know better. She stopped herself there because the sentence was starting to drift toward self-explanation, and self-explanation was a different thing from what she was trying to do. Arya was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet, not awkward, not withholding, but thinking clearly before she spoke. My dad does that, she said. Not the judging wrong part. The other part, the seeing what's missing. He does it with everything. Cars mostly, but not just cars. She looked at the tarp, then back at Evelyn. He walked around this thing for about 90 seconds before he decided to buy it. $120. And everyone else at that auction saw what it looked like, and he saw what it was. She said it without any particular pride or emphasis, just as a statement of fact in the same register that Diana used when she identified the VIN. He's always done that. I've never understood how. The sentence landed the way true things land, without drama, without intent to wound, and therefore more accurately than anything aimed could have been. Evelyn had spent her professional life in a world organized around surface information, quarterly numbers, market positioning, brand optics, the visual language of value. She had built a career on reading those signals correctly and moving faster than competitors on what they meant. And she had stood in a parking lot today and looked at a car worth more than $3 million and ordered it destroyed because the surface information was wrong, and it had not occurred to her, not for 1 second, to look deeper than what she could see. That was the thing Arya had just said. Quietly, without accusation, in the same tone she might use to describe what her father ordered for breakfast. And it hit with the force of something that didn't need to be stated loudly to be completely accurate. Evelyn stood with it. She didn't offer a follow-up apology or a reframing. She just stood with the weight of what a 16-year-old had just made plain in 4 sentences without trying. Liam had drifted close enough to hear. He didn't intervene, and he didn't look at Evelyn with any satisfaction. He looked at Arya the way you look at someone who has said the thing you spent years trying to find the right words for. Diana finished her calls near the hood of her car and came back across the lot with her notebook open. She had been on the phone for the better part of 20 minutes first, with a colleague who handled Shelby documentation, then with the director of a restoration facility in California that was recognized internationally as the correct address for exactly this kind of work. She had also taken 14 photographs and sent them to 2 independent authenticators, who had both replied, within the time it took her to make her second call with confirmations. She went to Liam and laid out what she had. The documentation process would take time several months, at minimum possibly closer to 6, if they were going to establish full provenance correctly and ensure the car's history could be traced cleanly to its original production record. Skipping that step was possible, but it would cost significantly at auction, and it would create the kind of uncertainty that serious collectors didn't forgive. The restoration itself, done right, was an 18-month to 24-month process at the facility she'd contacted, depending on the condition of the engine block once the car was fully stripped. The estimate she'd received informally for a full matching numbers restoration with correct period-accurate part sourcing was somewhere between $200,000 and $280,000. Liam listened to all of this without interrupting. When Diana finished, he asked 2 questions, one about the specific authenticator she'd used, whose work he apparently knew, and one about the California facility's current wait list. Diana answered both with the precision of someone who had been expecting to be asked exactly those questions. "I'm not selling it," Liam said when Diana finished. "Not right now. Maybe not ever." Diana didn't appear surprised. "Then the restoration timeline is less critical than the documentation." "Right," Liam said. "Get the history right first. Everything else follows from that." Diana nodded and made a note. She had been in this business long enough to know the difference between people who found something valuable and immediately began calculating the exit, and people who found something valuable and wanted to understand it fully before deciding what it meant. The first category was more common. The second category produced better outcomes, usually for everyone involved, including the car. She told Liam she would put him directly in contact with the documentation specialist, that she would be available as a reference for the restoration facility's intake process, and that she would like if he was willing to include the discovery of the car in a piece she was writing for a collector's publication. Not the personal details, just the provenance story and the authentication notes. Liam said he'd think about it. They shook hands, and Diana walked back toward the atrium. The showcase wound down in the way that events do when the thing everyone will remember about them has already happened in a parking lot, rather than on the designated floor. The registered exhibitors retrieved their vehicles with their customary care. The media left in two waves, first the cameras, then the print journalists, then the bloggers, who had been live posting from the edge of the crowd and would file their pieces in the car on the way back to wherever they worked. Gerald, whose Bel Air had been the original reason for Liam's presence, found him near the truck and shook his hand, and said in the understated way of men who had known each other for a long time, without knowing each other well, that it had been quite an afternoon. Evelyn left after a brief private meeting with her publicist and the showcase's media coordinator in the atrium entrance. She did not issue a public statement from the parking lot. That would come later through the correct channels with the correct language. What she left with was not a strategy or a plan. It was the particular quiet of someone who had watched a version of themselves, the one that moved through the world, assuming that what she could see was all there was, encounter its own limitation in the most public and irrefutable possible way. She got into the back of a car and was driven away, and the lot felt slightly different after she left, as though the specific pressure of her authority had taken up physical space, and its absence was measurable. Liam hooked the Cobra's trailer back to his truck, properly checked the hitch and the load straps, and walked around the vehicle one time, the way he always did before a drive. The tarp was secured at all corners. The tire that had partially deflated had been reinflated from the emergency compressor he kept in the truck bed. The car sat the way it had sat in his yard for the past 2 weeks, patient, still giving nothing away to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking at. Arya climbed into the passenger seat. She put her feet on the dashboard. This time, Liam looked at her feet and then looked back at the road without saying anything. She kept them there. They drove for a while without talking. The sun had moved into the lower quarter of the sky by the time they cleared the city, and the highway opened up into the kind of flat, quiet landscape that asked nothing of you except to move through it. The trailer was visible in the rear view, the tarp still in place, the shape beneath it unchanged. To anyone passing on the highway, it was just a flatbed with something covered on it, anonymous, unremarkable, exactly what it had always appeared to be from the outside. Arya had been looking out the passenger window for several miles when she said, without turning, "What are you going to do with it?" "Restore it," Liam said. "The right way. Take the time to do it correctly. That's going to cost a lot. Yes, more than it'll be worth not to sell it." Liam thought about that for a moment, the way he thought about things, not dramatically just turning it over, until he understood what shape it actually was. "It's not about what it's worth," he said. "It's about what it is. Something that survived that long without being ruined. It deserves to be brought back. Right. Not fast. Right." Arya turned from the window and looked at the side of his face. He was watching the road with the same expression he wore when he was listening to an engine, measuring reading, finding the signal in the noise. "She apologized," Arya said. "Evelyn. I know. I heard it." "Do you believe her?" Liam considered. "I think she meant it. Whether she learns anything from it, that's a different question. That takes longer than one afternoon." Arya seemed to accept this. She looked back out the window. The highway was quiet and wide, and the late afternoon light came in low from the west and made everything slightly warmer than it had been all day. After a while, Liam said, "Not everyone needs to know what something is worth before they respect it. He wasn't saying it for any particular effect. It was the kind of thing that surfaces when a long day is finally releasing its pressure, and there's enough quiet to hear what you've been thinking since before the thinking was clear. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without decoration, as a statement of what he understood to be true. Arya was quiet beside him. Then she said, "Like Dusty." Liam glanced at her. "My old stuffed rabbit," she said. "The one I've had since I was little. I know it looks like something you'd find in a donation bin, but I know what it is." She said it simply, without embarrassment, in the same matter-of-fact register she used for everything. "I've never needed anyone to tell me it was worth keeping." Liam looked back at the road. "Yeah," he said. "Like Dusty." They drove the rest of the way home without any further conversation, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, because everything that needed to be said has already been said. And the rest is just distance to cover. The truck moved steadily on the empty highway, and the trailer held steady behind it, and the car under the tarp rode through the late October dusk the way it had been riding for the last 30 years, without any announcement of itself, without any marker or signal of its own rarity. It had waited this long. It could wait a little longer. When they pulled into the yard and Liam cut the engine, he sat for a moment before getting out. He looked at the trailer in the side mirror, the shape under the tarp, the outlines visible in the fading light if you knew what you were looking for, which was exactly the point. You had to know what you were looking for. You had to be willing to stop when everything around you kept moving, to crouch near the thing everyone else had walked past, to read the number on the plate 3 times before you were certain. Most people never stopped. That wasn't a criticism. It was just how most people moved through the world at speed on surface toward the next thing. And the things they walked past stayed where they were, patient and unchanged, waiting for the one person who knew to look closer. Liam got out of the truck. He walked to the trailer and checked the straps one more time, not because they needed checking, but because it was the last thing he did every time, and the last thing he did was always done the same way as the first. Then he went inside to make dinner. The Cobra sat in the yard behind him, still covered, still quiet, still exactly what it had always been. A machine that had survived every hand that had failed to see it clearly, and had come to rest finally with someone who had paid $120 for it and expected nothing in return except the chance to understand what it actually was. That was enough. For now, that was everything.